Buddha was born Siddhartha. That was his birth name. In 563 BC. Now, we don't know when Buddha was born, the precise date. But in every tradition, they like to give the followers a precise date. So they have April 16th at 6 p.m. Buddha was born, you know. We have no record of that, so have that, be that as it may. Like Krishna, he was born to a royal family. You see, some of these messengers are born to merchant families like Christ and the Bab and Muhammad. Some are born to royal families like Baha'u'llah, Krishna, and Buddha. Some are born to priest families like Zoroaster. And so they come from different backgrounds, but it has nothing to do with nothing in terms of their station, their spiritual reality. He married a princess when he was 16 and had 2 beautiful children, had a lovely life, but he constantly, according to tradition, worried about wanted to know the cause of suffering. So all he had to do was to come to this lecture. Anyway, he left his family at 29 to search for the truth. Now, you know, of course, that the reality of the messenger is that he always knew the cause of suffering, and he always knew what the truth was. But this is for our benefit. So you have to be able to see that. Otherwise, you fall into the trap that the materialists fall into when they say that these great leaders were like you and me, and that they basically plagiarized from one another in order to say what they did, that Muhammad actually read the Bible and the Gospel because so much of what he revealed in the Quran appears to come directly from the Bible and the Gospel. Well, that would be fine if Muhammad could read, but he couldn't. So these messengers have innate knowledge. He lived in austerity to demonstrate the futility of this practice. You see, at that time, the Hindu practice was that you could not achieve enlightenment unless you deprived yourself of all earthly benefits. And so the practice was to become a mendicant, to travel with no little food and water and to beg, and to have no possessions. And that would be the secret to spirituality. Buddha goes and tries that, becomes very ill. His friends convince him to no longer do that. He gets back to a more moderate life. And you ask the question, why would a manifestation of God have to do that in the first place? He didn't do it for himself. He did it to show the futility of that kind of immoderate practice. He receives his vision under the so-called Bodha tree that he was Gautama Buddha. That's where he gets his name, is during this vision, which means the enlightened one. And his mission in this vision was to revive the true understanding of Hinduism. Buddha is to Hinduism as Christ is to Judaism. Christ came to revive the true understanding of the teachings of Moses. That's what he meant when he said, I come to fulfill the law and the prophets. I have come to give you an understanding of what they meant. And so Buddha came to revive the true understanding of Hindu teachings. He came in an era in which the priests were extremely corrupt. The people had turned Hinduism into mere rituals with very little understanding of the principles we've just talked about. He died at 80 in 483 BC of old age. He's one of the few prophets that did. Under the Bodhi tree, his vision took on the nature of 4 fundamental truths called the 4 Noble Truths. The first truth, all of them answering his question of why do we suffer. The first, and was delivered as his first sermon to a very small body of followers. The first way was the ways of suffering. What are the ways in which we suffer? The first is birth, the baby born from the womb world into this world. You see, my friends, the babies do not cry because of pain of birth. It's not why babies cry when they come into this world. Science has already shown that while they're going through the birth canal, the nerves of the baby are given a natural, I forget what they call it, to reduce the pain. They basically do not feel the pain of childbirth. The reason that children suffer in the birth process is the change from this wonderfully comfortable, carefree womb world into, in modern times, a world with people wearing masks, fluorescent lights, in some cases forceps, and a rather harsh environment. Even under the best of circumstances, in traditional birthing processes, it is a traumatic experience. In the womb, it had all its needs met. Oxygen was supplied very conveniently. The food was never a problem. Didn't have to chew. It received whatever the mother ate, though that sometimes was a problem. It had all its needs met, but it had strange things occurring in the womb world. It had these things on its head that didn't seem to have any other purpose than to poke at, such as these eyes and the nose. And it had a little opening in the front of the face for putting your thumb there, because that seemed to be the only purpose for it. But most inconveniently were these things dangling out from below and to the side that only got in the way and made it very uncomfortable, and as time went on, got more and more uncomfortable. But the purpose of those limbs was not known, nor any possible understanding of this world. And so it fears, on the one hand, exiting the womb world, and on the other hand, it's ready to go. Baha'u'llah, in his writings, and Abdu'l-Baha, who is the son of Baha'u'llah, will explain that this is exactly what this world is. This is the womb world for the next life. And the limbs we are creating here do not seem to function, but will be the perfect limbs for the next life. Those limbs will be perfections of character and spirit. So the birthing is suffering because it is a change from one reality to the next. Disease was another way of suffering. Disease means dis-ease, disharmony, imbalance. And again, the suffering resulting from disease is, if you understand true medicine, the cure of the disease. It is not till you suffer from the imbalance that the overt aspects of the imbalance become visible to you, because long before the overt aspects, the psychological, the spiritual and emotional and intellectual effects are already occurring. If we knew how to diagnose disease like the Greek philosophers did, we would see cancer much earlier on by the way people acted, the emotional problems they began to have, and the other signs that show themselves much sooner before the actual tumor or malignant tissue begins to form. Old age is another stage of suffering. I hear many people today say, when they look at the young people, "Oh, such beauty is wasted on the young," they say to me. My friends, could you imagine trying to prepare yourself for the next life, getting ready to depart this world, if we actually got more beautiful as we got older? It's difficult as it is with this old wrinkly body that's hanging around us, which is in perfect harmony with the process of moving on to the next world. Our holding on to our youth simply shows our spiritual bankruptcy. And then finally, death itself, which is like the birthing process from the womb world to this world. And we've already talked a little bit about it. But I want to give you a little story of an episode of a film called Return to Perry by Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead was a social anthropologist who, with her husband, Dr. Mead, back in the 20s, visited a small island of Perry in Micronesia. And then she returned in the 1960s and brought a film crew and showed an episode of an old woman dying in an extended family. And they lived on huts that were suspended on stilts above the water. And while she was dying, they arranged the children so that the youngest children were closest to her and her brothers and sisters were furthest from her. So that the youngest were closest to observe the death process and the older were furthest removed, which is the opposite of what we do today. And the children were stroking her and knew how to coach her in her death process, so that when she finally gave that last expulsion of life, all of the little children cheered, knowing that her soul had now moved on from this world to the next. And with great joy and singing, they prepared her body, with the little children assisting, preparing her for her funeral procession. What a far cry from an understanding that we now have in our Western world, where we place people in sterile environments, away from such kind of community, to allow them, for the most part, to die alone. The cause of suffering, he discovered from this vision, is attachment to worldly desires. It is our attachments to the old ways. It's the attachment of the child to the womb, the attachment of a person who is in a disease state to health, the attachment of the older people to their youth, and finally the attachment to this life, which in the Baha'i writings is called, in one place, a dust heap in comparison with the next world. The end of suffering, you do not have to be a rocket scientist. The end of suffering is detachment. And that's the third noble truth. It does not mean apathy. It does not mean that one becomes passive. It simply means that one's desires and hopes and loves is not based on the things that perish, as Christ admonished us. He said, do not yearn for the meat that perisheth, but the bread that is everlasting, referring to the higher understandings of your reality, that bread of life that he called it. In Buddha's term, he wrote, or he gave in the Dhammapada, which is written in the Dhammapada, he said, detachment from worldly attachments causes one's sorrows to fall away from him as drops from a lotus leaf. This detachment is the same as Krishna's admonition to denounce the fruits of action. It is all one thing, my friends. In Eastern religion, one of the beauties of it, this is why you need to study it, is because it teaches you the unity of all of the sciences. The science of well-being, the science of nature, the science of health, the science of life. All of it is one thing. It's all one science. It operates on the same principles. And finally, the path to detachment, the way we become detached, is to become obedient to the laws and the principles that Buddha brought. Or as St. Augustine said, that if you wish to understand the law of God, you must first obey it. We will see later in the Baha'i lecture, Baha'u'llah wrote a book called the Book of Certitude, where he will call this understanding to a higher level of what does search for truth mean? What does research mean? But we'll wait till we get to that point. Now, if the path to the detachment is Dharma, the middle path, he then defines it as 8 things that you must do. This is Buddha's covenant. This is what you know. Remember what the covenant means. Buddha guarantees you enlightenment if you strive to follow his commandments. You see, there's an if there. This is the free choice aspect. It says the first thing you must do is have the right view. And the right view, he said, is the 4 noble truths. Know what the purpose of life is. The purpose of life is detachment from your worldly desires and attachment to God. That's the right shraddha. The right intention to renounce the world. Okay. The intention means, actually, we say, people have said that the path to hell is paved with good intentions. I think, is that how it goes? My friends, I'd like you to reconsider that. Because really, all you have are your good intentions. If you really think what your freedom is, what is volition? Your volition is the decision to act. Your ability to act is in God's hands. You see, your reality is spiritual, meaning that your consciousness is not of this world. Kant will later show, the great German philosopher, that the only freedom you have is not of this world. It is the freedom to choose morality over selfish desire. That cannot happen, he proves, shows logically, cannot happen in this world, because this world is limited by nature. So our reality is spiritual. If it were not spiritual, we could not have this lecture series, we could not even be thinking about these topics. The mere fact that we even think about it means we're in a spiritual realm. Because what are we doing is we're violating nature. We're thinking about nature, which is a violation of nature. Nature would never intended us to think about it. In fact, it's quite alarmed at the prospect. Why? Because when you think about nature, means you command nature. And then science comes along, which becomes the dominates nature, becomes the superior to nature. You see, this going back to nature is a misunderstanding. We're not going back to becoming animals, my friends. God forbid. What we're doing is going back so we can respect nature. We've lost our respect for nature, but that's a spiritual disease. When I say science is to dominate nature, I mean science to dominate nature for the betterment of all. And even nature itself becomes improved as a result of proper stewardship. This is why the American Indians truly understand what stewardship means. We have to learn from them. I believe they will play a critical role in the future of humanity. Right conduct, right speech, to abstain from lies. My friend, right speech is much more than abstaining from lies. In a book written by Richard Feynman, the great physicist, he said, truth implies more than abstaining from lies. Truth implies that when a politician tells the truth, he tells the truth in a way that people can understand the relevant issues at hand, so that they can make an appropriate decision for themselves. The truth requires education. It requires patience. It requires taking the time to explain things so people can understand. What people call truth today is borderline truth at best. It is to protect themselves often. But truth, telling the truth, means that your motive is the betterment of all. Right conduct, to abstain from killing, theft, adultery, and intoxicants. Actually, these are the 10 Commandments. You know, the 10 Commandments are basically conduct code. There are a few spiritual things in there, like the monotheistic ones we talked about, but most of it's conduct. Social aspect is conduct. Right occupation. Now listen very carefully, my friends. Listen very carefully. This is a gem from Buddhism. If you learn nothing else from Buddhism, take this home with you. Buddha says, right occupation means you give more than you take. I would love to give that at that last board meeting of Enron. Yeah. Later we'll talk about civilization. The whole concept of a civilization is based upon accumulating wealth. You do not have growth without wealth, and you do not have wealth without people creating more than they take. I guarantee you it would be a wonderful, wonderful study if someday someone would correlate the rise and fall of civilization at that point in which people began to take more than they gave. I think you would see a one-to-one correlation. Do you think we're going to have a new civilization with our current attitudes? Right endeavor to choose good over evil, higher over lower. Evil is not black and white. My friends, what was good yesterday is evil today. As we progress as humanity in our evolution, good and evil constantly change to higher and higher modes. The evil today would have been considered glorious at the time of Moses, but is not sufficient today. Baha'u'llah, hidden words. Only deeds of stainless purity are accepted at the threshold. That's a criteria, if you ask me. Stainless? What does that mean? Eh? That's a new goal for humanity. Stainless purity. Only when total selflessness is present are your deeds accepted into heaven. When you're totally selfless, no consciousness of self, you give because of the love of giving. Right mindfulness. He said, control your mind and remain calm, especially at the most difficult time, which is when you die. He says it's easy to remain calm when everything is going well. If you want to know how calm you are, look at your behavior when everything around you is falling apart. Right contemplation. He said to meditate. What do you meditate on? You meditate on what He has given you, of course. See, today what we call meditation is only a preparation for meditation. Unless you have the Bhagavad Gita written on your navel, it makes no sense to stare at your navel. We're to meditate on the higher knowledge and how we can bring spiritual truth into our lives. We're to meditate our understanding of things. But if that understanding cannot be translated into your life, then what good is it? In our lecture tomorrow, when we cover the Greek philosophers, we'll see true philosophy is what you are, not what you think. You know, philosophy today in the university is talk about talk. But true philosophy is becoming what you know, which is what religion is. Religion is true philosophy. You think you can become what you know without religion? I don't think so. Neither did the Greeks. Now, he put his eternal truths in a book called the Dhammapada. And they're done in little quotes. He said, the soul, how do we know we have a soul? He says, because the soul is that other voice that talks to you. When you're by yourself, you talk to yourself. What is meant by talking to yourself? You're talking to your soul. You have the outer mind talking to the inner mind, the one that knows everything, the one that knows what you're actually supposed to do, versus the one that wants to do this, that is talking to the one that says, no, it's not what you want to do, it's what you ought to do. And if we fail to listen to the inner voice, Socrates said, it will die. It will atrophy and become so weak we won't hear it anymore, and that is the beginning of the end of our moral life. It's called the slippery road in modern lingo. He therefore gave these wonderful little sayings. Listen carefully. He said, rouse thyself by thyself. Rouse thyself by thyself. You see, you say that to people and they say, mumble jumble, right? That's because they're not listening. When you talk to yourself, it is this self talking to this self. It is your time-space self, the one that is thinking about what you're going to eat in the next dinner time, what you want, what kind of car you're going to buy, okay, what promotion are you working for at work. That self is talking to this self, which is concerned about your character, which is concerned about what kind of human being you are, not in the eyes of others, but to yourself. My friends, if you're a good person because of others, you have missed the point. Maybe we need social pressure so we behave better. But the purpose of behaving better is to discover ourselves. He said, to know thyself is the highest knowledge. See, we're going to discover that to know yourself is to know God. Same thing. He said the ego is good. See, a lot of these Zen Buddhists running around, ego bad, bad ego. Ego is good, my friends. Ego is the self. Freud, superego. He said what's bad is egoism, which focuses on the self. Selfish. Egoism, selfish. Occupied with one's desires and ephemeral attachments. We got to change our language. All right. God, he said, is the absolute, the uncreated, the first cause, because the Hindus had perverted the concept of God. And we're now forming idols. You know how many idols there are in Hinduism today? You know how many idols there are in Buddhism today? He said divinity is unknowable. All paths are closed, he said. No measure measures him. Listen to that. I mean, this guy was really smart. No measure. Do you know what the soul is according to the Greeks? It is called the rational soul. And we'll talk about this later. The rational soul measures things by a standard. We make judgments. That's why we have a soul. So we make judgments. That's where morality comes from. Okay. So how do you measure the creator of the measurement? You see? No measure measures him. See, another way of thinking about God. Yeah. He said, I have come from a chain of Buddhas, and I shall return as the fifth Buddha. So he talks about, again, sequence of religions, sequence of appearances, just like Hinduism. But instead of calling them avatars, he calls them Buddhas. When asked about creation, he said, listen so carefully here, my friends. Creation is not a time-space event. The beginning of the universe did not occur with the Big Bang. So you got a problem if you think the universe began with the Big Bang. Because the philosophers will show logically that you cannot have a creator unless you have a creation. That meant there was a time where God wasn't a creator. How could the creator be known if there's no creation? The Buddha says, well, listen, creation doesn't mean time-space event. He says, creation is continuous. Evolution is creation in action. My friends, you realize what the Hinduism, Buddhism brings to consciousness. It brings the understanding that every time you make a moral decision, you recreate yourself. You're reborn. Every time you make a decision to change according to your knowledge, that is the rebirth. That you recreate yourself into a new creation when you recognize and obey a messenger of God. Why? Because every religion says that when you recognize and obey a messenger of God, forces are released that transform your reality. That is called the rebirth. Born again, my friends. Except it's not a one-time event. Salvation doesn't occur. I believe, my friends, that is such a misunderstanding. It's I believe every moment of my existence until I die. Salvation is a process of consciousness and decision-making. Because if you say I believe but you don't act on your knowledge, you think that's your salvation? Big surprises in the next world. Pleasure of the senses is really suffering in disguise. How can that be? Go out and have a good time. How can that be suffering? Give me some more suffering. Listen to what he says. Listen to what he says. The physical world is a vapor in the desert. Fools are immersed in it, but the wise have no attachment to it. Because, my friends, you may think it's pleasure, but what it does is it detracts you and distracts you from your real purpose. You can have pleasure, but don't become attached to it. Because you're going to have to become detached from it at some point. Peoples whose marriage is based on pleasure usually do not last. Marriage has to be more than pleasure. All things that are of value have to be beyond pleasure. They have to be because of the love of their beauty. It's beautiful. And he says, his last sermon he gives before he dies, he said, "Be ye lamps unto yourselves." This is the Buddhist version of independent investigation of truth. Listen to what he says. Rely on yourselves and do not rely on any external help. He's not talking about building a house. Hold fast to the truth as a lamp. Seek salvation alone in the truth. Be steadfast in resolve. Keep watch over your own hearts. Whosoever holds fast to the truth shall cross the ocean. Buddhism, uses the metaphor of the ocean. And shall cease suffering. He is the first prophet that gave full rights to women. He even created a separate school and monastery for women to become educated. All of those rights were removed within 100 years of his death. As we will find in all of the religions, women are given right by the prophet, and then they're taken away by the clergy after the prophet dies. He said, I give you no successor, you elect one, because it doesn't matter who you elect as long as you're unified. He is the first to really illustrate the point of necessity of unity. There's some profound statements in religion which says, even if you agree to believe something that isn't correct is better than if you disagree. Because if you are unified in the incorrectness of it, or believe that this incorrect thing, the truth of it will be made known to you, and you'll be able to correct it very rapidly. But if you're disunified, the disunity has a power of its own to continue, and you'll never get to the truth. So Buddha says, I don't care who you elect, just agree on it. Become unified. Unity. Let's have a 5-minute break. Oh, I got to give you the prophecy. He said, I shall return as the 5th Buddha, the Maitreya Amitabha, the glory of God. He is depicted in a statue of the Buddha, of the 5th Buddha, the Maitreya Buddha, holding an exquisite vase. I've seen this statue. I need slides for this lecture series. And this vase, he dispenses jewels of eternal knowledge on which a new understanding and social order will be built. That's on his return. So let's have a 5-minute break, then we'll cover Zoroaster.